Wasabi guys, coming back at y'all with another Commander deck tech. We're going to be looking at Rivals of Ixalan again, and the awesome Commander option that is Nezahal Primal Tide. 7 mana blue 7/7 legendary elder dinosaur. This guy is just bonkers. He can't be countered, which is already pretty good. If your commander can just get out there with no interruptions, that's awesome. You have no maximum hand size, which, this is blue. Having that on your commander, again, is ridiculous. Whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, you get to draw a card. Let that sink in for a second, because non-creature spells are the majority of spells in the format to begin with. Even your creature-based decks are still going to rely on non-creature spells, just for consistency, for setup purposes. So getting Nezahal out there earlier on in the game is important because you want to run into more of these non-creature spells. It allows you to draw more cards. And even if you don't get to take advantage of every other deck at the table, usually the control deck or the storm deck or whatever deck that wants to combo off and win is going to be playing some non-creature spells, allowing you to draw cards. So that is obviously the best thing about Nezahal, is the good card draw. Now the last ability, you get to discard 3 cards and exile Nezahal, return it to the battlefield tapped under your control at the beginning of the next end step. It's a good thing it says owner's control, so your opponents, if they want to take advantage of that, they can't just take control of Nezahal and then exile it. It does come back under your control, which is a nice thing. So before I get into the actual deck, this is actually not my own. This is one of my friends. I just went on his tapped out and just decided to make a video about it. But I think it's pretty cool. It's your basic mono blue control shell. And even at that, it's still pretty good. You do play a lot of your typical cantrips, counter spells, just to make blue as good as it possibly can be. But even if you just look at Nezahal, it's sort of like the one-man army. It's going to give you a good creature out there, a 7/7 in blue. It's usually something we don't see a lot of. We do see some good sea creatures, but a good sea creature commander is pretty funny. Before we actually get onto the good stuff, we're just going to go over a few of the lands. Now, I can expect this is probably going to be a prototype. He hasn't actually built the deck yet, so once he's built it, I'm sure there's going to be many improvements. But we do have the Arch of Orazca, which, playing it at pre-release, it was actually quite underrated. Once you do get the City's Blessing, which is a joke, it's super easy to get that. If it's easy to get it at pre-release, it's going to be easy to get it in Commander. So once you do get it, you get 5 mana to tap it to draw a card, which is just good basic consistency. Not super fantastic, but you do get card draw on a land, which is underrated. Buried Ruin, I can only imagine. He doesn't play Academy Ruins, so the artifact love in the deck is going to be there. Mystifying Maze. Again, Maze of Ith isn't in the deck, so I can only imagine when he actually decides to build the deck, he's obviously going to improve and throw some of those better options in there. But it is a way to nullify an attacking creature. Reliquary Tower, pretty basic. In mono blue decks, you are going to draw probably the most cards at the table. You don't want to have to discard any of them. It is kind of redundant that our commander can also do it, which, worst case scenario, it's off the field and we have to discard cards. We have Reliquary Tower. Rogue's Passage, again, Nezahal doesn't really have any keywords, it's just a 7/7, so making Nezahal unblockable is sometimes the good thing to do. That's going to do it for the land base for the most part. It's just your islands. Could also throw in some snow-covered islands, which I don't think he has in the actual deck yet, but that is just a chore of its own. And I'm going to tell you why you do need snow-covered islands in a minute. Now we move on to the artifacts, which are just going to be for good consistency and ramp. Astral Cornucopia, get to put as much mana as you want to X, and then you get to choose a color, and then it adds 1 mana of any color to your mana pool for each charge counter on Astral Cornucopia. So if you pay 6 mana total, it's going to enter the battlefield with 2 charge counters. It's not the best artifact ramp, but it's definitely a good thing to spend a lot of useless mana on if you don't have really anything to do. And even if you do spend all that mana on it, you get mana back for it. But again, it's one of those mana rocks that's just going to put in a ton of work, whether you realize it or not. Even if it is a lot to put into it, you're going to get a lot out of it. Sensei's Divining Top, this is good consistency. You want to make sure the top card of your library is good. Soul Ring, pretty basic. Cold Steel Heart, we get to choose a color. It does enter the battlefield tapped, but it does tap for blue mana, which is a good thing. Lightning Greaves, good protection. If we desperately need to protect Nezahal, we don't want to discard 3 cards, we have that option to just give him Shroud, which is a good thing. Star Compass, basically the same thing as Cold Steel Heart. A little bit better though because we don't have to just be restricted to a certain color, but in this case it is just going to tap for blue. Thought Vessel, no maximum hand size. Again, redundancy isn't a bad thing when you can ensure you don't have to discard cards. It's still going to ramp us up 1 mana though. Commander Sphere gets us blue mana, can also sacrifice itself to draw a card. Going to help speed up the deck when you can get both forms of consistency. Extra planar lens, the main reason why I said you probably need some snow-covered islands. Gonna keep everyone else with basic islands from getting that extra mana, and you do have to exile an island in order to get the double mana. But once you do get mana doublers, in Commander you pretty much have a ton of mana you can dump into X-costed spells, stuff like that, which is why mana doublers are usually pretty good in monocolor decks. Sculpting Steel, we do play a lot of good artifacts. Getting a copy of one of them isn't a bad thing. Worn Power Stone enters the battlefield tap, but is basically Soul Ring for 3 mana, so it's significantly worse. But more mana rocks is never a bad thing if you need the mana ramp, if you need that consistency. If you want to get Nezahal out there earlier, I can definitely understand it. The Dalkon Aura is a perfect card in a control deck. Flashing stuff into play gives you basically all the mana you want to do stuff on your opponent's turns. Save it all up, all of your lands are untapped. If they want to do something, you have the mana to threaten a counterspell. If not, you have the mana to flash your stuff into play at your opponent's end step. Just a brilliant card. Advantage and timing is always good. Gauntlet of Power, another mana doubler. Basic lands that tap for the chosen color, they get to add another one of that mana to their mana pool. So this is also kind of one of those things where hopefully your opponents aren't playing as many basic islands. And chosen creatures of that color also get an Anthem. They get +1/+1, which is pretty underrated, but still, mana doublers, if you have multiple of them out there, they should benefit you more so than your opponents. Gilded Lotus is one of my favorite cards in the format. You guys know that. Taps to add 3 mana of any one color to your mana pool. In this case, we're probably just going to add blue. And we get the reason why he decided to throw a ton of these artifacts in there. We get the Paradox Engine, which really shouldn't be too hard if you have all this mana to work with, and you just have a good cantrip on a commander that's going to give you card draw whenever your opponents cast non-creature spells. You should have a ton of cards to work with and a ton of card draw. And once you have those two things, you can just untap all your mana rocks, tap them for more mana, cast your cantrips, draw more cards, and just eventually get to what I can only assume is a Laboratory Maniac win con in the deck. And to wrap up artifacts, we do have a Caged Sun, which is another mana doubler. It's the safest one because it doesn't give it to your opponents. And it also gives your creatures of the chosen color +1/+1. It doesn't give it to your opponent's creatures as well. Now he does play 18 creatures, so let's get into that. We see a Baral, Chief of Compliance, which is perfect for this deck. You can counter spells pretty easily, so you should be able to get more card draw. And your instant and sorcery spells cost 1 less, which is usually good if you have a Paradox Engine combo on the board. Less mana you spend means the more you can save for your other good spells. Jayce for Prodigy, another good way to draw some cards earlier in the game. Also flips into Jayce Telepath Unbound, and also gives you a way to give you those instant and sorcery cards from your graveyard, and you get to recast them. So very good either way. Earlier on though, getting that card draw is pretty good. Snapcaster Mage is just going to be a staple in every single blue deck in the format, I feel. If you are playing good instant and sorceries, why not just, hey, 2 mana, you get to flash it back. If you're desperate for a cantrip, if you're desperate for a counter spell, you have them there. So pretty good. Pretty much a staple. Airtie Wizard Adept, this guy is fantastic. You can pay 4 mana and tap him to counter target spell, which after a certain point of the game, if you're just threatening with a ton of mana and all these other counter spells, all you really have to do is just counter with this guy every time your opponent tries to play their best spell out of their hand, and then just save everything else for whatever else they might have if you're done actually tapping Airtie to counter. So very difficult to deal with. You can't just counter this guy unless you have something like a Stifle or a Disallow, anything that can counter an activated ability, but just a huge pain if you have a ton of mana to work with and this guy out at the same time. And then we have Fate Spinner, just going to force each of our opponents to choose which step they like, their draw step, their main phase, or their combat phase, and they actually have to choose which step they want to do without. So if they don't want to draw and they want to cast spells, they want to attack you, then they have to basically say it right there. So you're already going to prepare yourself for what they're going to do, which is always pretty good. There's some good cards that do that in the format. It's also good just to keep your opponents from attacking you, because a lot of them, if they just want to get good stuff out there, it's easy to just deny themselves their combat phase because they usually don't really have any beef with you and they probably don't want to attack you anyway. So it's a good card. It's not going to shut down your opponents who want to just combo off, but it's going to at least let the people know at the table, okay, this is what they're about to do before they do it. So if they're so desperate to skip their main phase or their draw phase, you know they're probably going to want to attack someone, because it's so easy to just deny themselves the combat phase. So if they don't choose that phase, then you know something's about to happen. Kefnet the Mindful is a good flyer, indestructible, likely going to have enough cards in hand to satisfy the condition, whether or not he can attack or block, and also has an activated ability. We can pay 4 mana, draw a card, and then bounce a land back to our hand, which isn't that great compared to a lot of the other card draws, so really just in here as a good value creature for the mana, but not terrible if we need the card draw. And we of course have Laboratory Maniac. As I predicted, in most mono blue decks in the format, card draw is usually our engine, and this is our win con, so pretty cool. Glenalendra Archmage, the typical pain in the ass that it is to counter non-creature spells. And again, it's sort of like Airtie, where you need something like a disallow in order to counter the activated ability, so that's pretty good. Phyrexia Metamorph, pretty much a staple in the format, gonna give you some good artifacts to copy, creatures to copy, take advantage of that, awesome. Solemn Simulacrum, good consistency, good land ramp. In a mono blue deck, we don't necessarily have the best ones aside from our mana rocks, so getting lands and getting a way to draw a card when it dies is pretty good. Magus of the Future is going to let us play with the top card of our library revealed, and it might as well just say, hey, your maximum hand size is increased by 1, because that's basically what it does. Lets you play the top card of your library, which is good for comboing off. If your top deck is something like a land, well, then you can play that land, given you haven't already played your land drop for the turn, and it's going to make your top deck even better. Just a great card in blue. I don't think enough people know about it, but it just puts in so much work in these decks. Psychosis Crawler, you might have heard 1,000 times already, but we do draw a ton of cards in the deck. Nezahal makes it pretty easy to do that. In addition to a lot of the other cantrips and other effects, we can just draw a ton of cards in the deck, make Psychosis Crawler extremely deadly. It's also going to be pretty big. Teferi Mage of Zhalfir is a good control card, going to lock down certain opponents who want to dictate what you do on your turn. They can play spells only as a sorcery, so usually during their main phase. Also has the benefit of giving creature cards you own that aren't in play flash, and he also has flash himself, so advantage of timing, again, always good. Arcanus the Omnipotent, also pretty good. Taps to draw us 3 cards, also has some good evasion, also has a good way to dodge removal. Pay 4 mana, return it to your hand. Kind of like the Palinchron, but gonna draw you some cards. Pretty good. Scourge of Fleets. Awesome card in blue. Kind of fits the theme. If you have a gigantic sea creature as a commander, why not play a Kraken? Enters the battlefield, returns each creature your opponents control with toughness X or less to their hand, where X is the number of islands you control. We do play a lot of islands, so never really a bad thing. And of course, we are playing Sphinx of the Final Word because we just want to terrorize people. Can't be countered, flying hexproof. Instant and sorcery spells you control can't be countered by spells or abilities. Oh my gosh, this guy is just overwhelmingly painful, just excruciatingly painful to have to deal with this type of control. Your stuff can't be countered. You're basically just screwing with the other control decks at the table when you play this card. It's basically going to protect whatever combos you want to do, whatever cantrips, counter spells you cast. Just a brilliant card. Belongs in every single mono blue deck in the format. Stormtide Leviathan, just another awesome sea creature. All lands are islands in addition to their other types, and creatures without flying or island walk can't attack, which doesn't really help our commander out, but we do have an 8/8 here with Island Walk, so at the very least it's going to keep our opponents from attacking unless those creatures have flying, which is still pretty good, but mainly in there just as a huge creature with Island Walk, so that's pretty good. Jingataxius is another mono blue staple. Punishes our opponents at the end step, forces them to discard, and then we get to draw 7 cards at our end step. All on flash for 10 mana, which seems unreasonable, but once you get it out there, just dominates. Fantastic. And we do have 2 enchantments. We have Search for Azcanta, 2 mana enchantment. You do get to look at the top card of your library and decide whether or not you want it in your hand, or you could just put it into your graveyard. That's pretty good. And then if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, you get to flip it into Azcanta, the Sunken Ruin. Has an activated ability that basically lets you look at the top 4. So it's not going to be fantastic in Commander, but it's going to give you some consistency at the top of your deck, which is pretty nice. Then we play Arkham Age Ascension. At the beginning of our end step, if we drew 2 or more cards this turn, we get to put a quest counter on it. And as long as it has 6 or more quest counters, if we would draw a card, instead we get to search our library for a card, put it into our hand, and then shuffle our library. So basically Demonic Tutor counter every single time we would draw a card, which is just freaking ridiculous in this deck, where you can just get a ton of card draw off your commander. All you need is 6 counters, and when you consider a lot of our card draw is going to be on our opponent's turns when they cast non-creature spells, it's going to be super easy to get the 6 quest counters on it. So in no time we're just going to be comboing off with our combo pieces. In no time we're just going to be getting our best cantrips, our best counter spells, our best artifacts, our Paradox Engine, those things all good. We do have 3 sorceries in the deck. We have Fabricate, probably to get our Paradox Engine or an extra planar lens. Whatever we would need from our artifacts at that moment, we get it with Fabricate. Time Warp, taking an extra turn for 5 mana, is still pretty busted in Commander, and All Is Dust is going to deal with all colored permanents. Good thing a lot of our deck is good artifacts that are going to survive this, but going to punish so many other decks that do depend on colored permanents. Now we move on to the last part of the deck, which is the bulk of the deck, and that is instants. We play a ton of them. Brainstorm, good cantrip, top 3, and then you get to put 2 cards back, so really good with shuffle effects, stuff like that. High Tide, really good if we just want to go off on the same turn. Gonna double all our islands, the mana they produce, so that's pretty good. Counterspell, pretty basic. Counterspell. Cyclonic Rift, one of the better cards in the format. You are almost always going to overload it and bounce everything back to your opponent's hands. Just one of the most busted cards in the format. Pull from Tomorrow, very underrated X-costed draw spell. You get to draw X cards and then discard a card. So all at instant speed, you get a ton of card draw at your opponent's end step likely. In addition to all the other cantrips and Nezahal, it's going to put in a lot of work in the deck. Blue Sun Zenith, same thing, another good X-costed spell. Another reason to have a ton of mana with Paradox Engine off your mana rocks is to dump it all into these spells, and you get a ton of it, instant speed. Does shuffle itself back into your library, which can be interpreted as good or bad, but who really cares? It gives you a lot of card draw. Capsize, awesome card. Again, if you have a ton of mana at your disposal, why not just buy this back over and over again, and your opponents are going to be completely helpless? Just a fantastic card, one of the more underrated blue cards in the format. Dissipate, counters a spell. If it's countered that way, you exile it. Really good against the best spell they have that they can get back from their graveyard. Maybe it's your opponent's Paradox Engine, maybe it's your opponent's creature that they can combo off with. Just deadly all around. Dissolve, gonna counterspell, you get to scry 1. Pretty basic, good consistency, can't complain too much. Forbid, the buyback should be incredibly easy in this deck where we have a ton of cards in our hand. 3 mana over and over again to counter whatever spell is going to guarantee that we always have a counter spell in our hand, which just frightens so many people, and it's absolutely hilarious. Void Shatter, going to counter a spell. It has no color, so if that applies to anything in the format, there you go. But it is going to basically be another Dissipate where it exiles the spell, so pretty good. Cryptic Command, very versatile, gives you the ability to choose between 4 modes. You get to choose 2 of them. Counter target spell, return a permanent to its owner's hand, tap all creatures your opponent controls, and then you get to draw a card. So getting to choose 2 of those instant speed is pretty good. In a mono blue deck, options and bounce removal, sometimes you have to settle for it, but it's usually pretty good. Engulf the Shore, good 4 mana instant sort of board wipe. Gonna return to their owner's hands all creatures with toughness less than or equal to the number of islands we control. So even if this does return our Nezahal, what we can easily do is just discard 3 cards and then exile it and then have it come back. So we can easily dodge it with Nezahal and just let our opponents feel the full wrath of that. But just a fantastic card. Pretty good if you can get some sort of removal in blue, but unfortunately you do have to settle for bounce removal, which isn't always the most effective. We have Insidious Will, which is another pretty versatile counterspell. Doesn't see a lot of play. Gonna counter target spell. You get to choose one of 3 modes. You may choose new targets for a target spell, or you get to copy a target instant or sorcery spell, and you get to choose new targets for the copy. So it's either going to counter a spell, it's going to reverberate, or it's just going to change the target. So pretty good card. Either way you look at it, good value. Last Word, basically your uncounterable counterspell, can't be countered by spells or abilities, very good. Overwhelming Denial, another thing, can't be countered by spells or abilities, can pay a search cost if you've played a spell this turn, so for just 2 mana, having an uncounterable counterspell is ridiculous. Rewind, gets you that mana back, maybe then some if you have mana doublers. Untapping any lands in Commander is usually pretty busted, so very good counterspell. Summary Dismissal, gonna deal with all other spells and abilities on the stack. That is just ridiculous. Your opponents use some activated abilities, someone might flash into play something in response, the stack just gets bigger, you then play Summary Dismissal, exiles all of them, and you counter all abilities. Then we have Desertion. We get to counter a target spell, and if an artifact or creature spell is countered this way, we put that card onto the battlefield under our control instead of its owner's graveyard. So it's kind of like the perplexing chimera of counter spells. We get to steal their artifact or creature that they cast. So brilliant in mono blue, where you can just fool with your opponents, take their stuff and counter it at the same time. Evacuation. Again, the majority of removal in blue is going to be bounce removal, and sometimes settling for it is not the worst thing in the world. It does delay the game to the point where you can just get back on top, so not really bad. Force of Will, for free counterspell, is usually going to be pretty good. Spell Swindle, kind of like a budget version of Mana Drain. For all intents and purposes, it does the same thing. It's going to get you mana. It is 5 mana, so it's a bit more expensive. But countering the best spell, maybe like 6 or 7 mana, and getting that much in terms of mana is pretty good. Dig Through Time is going to be the last card. It's going to do it for the deck tech, and it's a pretty good one. You can delve it out there, make it to where it's just 2 blue, and you get to look at the top 7 and choose 2 of those, put those into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library. Great way to get your combo pieces quicker. It's honestly one of my favorite blue cards because it puts in so much work. If you can then recast it from your graveyard, look at the top 7. Sooner or later, you are going to get to your Paradox Engine, your other combo pieces, and that's usually pretty good. So anyway, guys, that's going to do it for this Nezahal Primal Tide Commander deck tech. Again, just to remind you, the link to this deck list will be in the description box below. And also, this isn't my own deck. This is one of my friend's decks. Just thought it would be interesting to show someone else's perspective on deck building. So anyway, let me know if you liked it. Leave some encouraging comments in the comment section below. Also, like the video, share it with your friends. Anyway, you guys have a wonderful day. Void here signing off.